When we first moved into Willow Creek, it seemed like the kind of neighborhood that families dreamed of. Manicured lawns, flower beds trimmed to perfection, and neighbors who waved politely as they passed by. But beneath the shiny surface of order and civility lurked something far darker. The Homeowners Association wasn't just a group of people keeping the community tidy. It was a machine of control, powered by one woman who treated the bylaws as her personal commandments. Her name was Marjorie, though everyone in the neighborhood simply called her Karen. Not because it was her real name, but because of the way she acted. She had the sharpness of a hawk, always watching, always waiting for someone to make the smallest misstep. A garbage can left on the curb an hour too long, a garden gnome placed in the wrong spot, a car parked just slightly beyond the painted line. Nothing escaped her gaze. And when she saw it, she pounced. Letters, fines, threats of legal action. She ruled not with fairness, but with intimidation. At first, my daughter, Amelia, and I didn't think much of it. We were outsiders, new to the neighborhood, and too busy settling in to care about the politics of lawn care or mailboxes. What Marjorie didn't know, though, was that Amelia wasn't just an ordinary homeowner. She was the sheriff of our small town, the kind of woman who spent her days handling disputes far more serious than barking dogs or hedges grown too tall. Amelia was calm, steady, and unshaken by threats. But to Marjorie, she was just another target to mold into obedience. The first sign of trouble came only weeks after we moved in. A letter appeared in our mailbox, stamped with the HOA's seal, declaring that we had yet to pay the association's membership dues. It demanded immediate payment and threatened escalating fines if we failed to comply. Amelia read it once, then set it aside. Unlike most, she knew the law. Our house was on the edge of Willow Creek, part of the neighborhood but exempt from mandatory HOA membership. The contract was clear. We were under no obligation to join, but Marjorie didn't see it that way. To her, everyone who lived within her neatly defined borders was under her rule, no exceptions. The next week, a second letter came, this one more hostile, then a third, stamped in red, with words like final notice and legal action pending. Amelia remained calm, filing each letter away. She knew how bullies worked. They pushed until they hit a wall. She was prepared to be that wall. Marjorie, however, wasn't used to resistance. Most of the neighbors were too frightened or too weary to push back against her. They paid the fees, followed the rules, and whispered their frustrations behind closed doors. For her, Amelia's refusal was more than just a personal insult. It was a threat to her authority. And when her authority was threatened, Marjorie didn't back down. She escalated. Soon the letters turned into uninvited visits. Marjorie would stand on our porch, clipboard in hand, tapping her pen against the paper, as if she were already tallying up fines. Amelia, patient as ever, reminded her each time that we were not bound by her association. But Marjorie only grew bolder, her tone sharper, her threats more desperate. She began to spread rumors around the neighborhood, painting Amelia as a troublemaker, a rule breaker, someone who thought she was above everyone else. What Marjorie didn't know was that every attempt to intimidate Amelia only strengthened her resolve. Years in law enforcement had taught her to deal with people far more dangerous than a woman with a clipboard and a superiority complex. But the neighborhood didn't see that side of Amelia yet. To them, she was just quiet, calm, and unwilling to bend. To Marjorie, that looked like weakness, and then came the day that changed everything. The afternoon was hot, the kind of day when the sun baked the sidewalks, and even the birds hid in the shade. Amelia had just returned from work, still in her sheriff's uniform, though she had thrown a jacket over it to keep things casual. She was unloading groceries from the back of the car when Marjorie appeared once again, storming up the driveway, with her usual fire in her eyes. But this time, she wasn't carrying a clipboard. This time, she was carrying something far more dangerous. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, as Marjorie reached into her bag and pulled out a small, handgun. She pointed it at Amelia, her voice sharp with anger, demanding once more that she join the HOA or face consequences. In that moment, the facade of control Marjorie had built shattered, revealing the dangerous instability that had always been hiding beneath her obsession with power. But what she didn't realize was that the woman she was threatening wasn't just a homeowner. She was the sheriff. And this time, Marjorie had crossed a line she could never step back from. The neighborhood was about to witness a reckoning. The moment the gun was raised, the world seemed to freeze. The sun still burned hot against the pavement, cicadas still hummed in the distance, but for everyone who witnessed it, time slowed into sharp, breathless fragments. Marjorie's hand trembled slightly, though her eyes were locked with Amelia's, blazing with the certainty of someone who had convinced herself she held all the power. The neighbors, who happened to be peeking from their windows, froze as well, wide-eyed but silent, unwilling to intervene. It was not the first time Marjorie had used intimidation to bend people to her will, but this was different. In her obsession with control, she had crossed into dangerous territory, no longer wielding fines or threats of liens but a weapon capable of ending lives. The irony was heavy in the air. She wanted absolute authority, yet in her recklessness, she had handed over all the evidence needed to destroy her reign. Amelia didn't flinch. The years she had spent as sheriff had taught her that showing fear in the face of a weapon only gave the aggressor more power. She stood still, her posture calm but commanding. What Marjorie failed to see was the subtle shift happening in that moment. The balance of control was already tipping. While the HOA president believed she had cornered her opponent, the truth was that Amelia now had justification to act not just as a neighbor, but as the law itself. Slowly, carefully, Amelia let her jacket slip aside, revealing the polished silver badge pinned to her chest. It caught the sunlight, flashing unmistakably, a symbol of the authority Marjorie had so carelessly challenged. The sight of it was like a crack of thunder in the silence. For the neighbors hidden behind curtains, it was a revelation. For Marjorie, it was a mistake she could not undo. The HOA president's face shifted from fury to shock, her bravado faltering as the reality of the situation settled in. She wasn't staring down an ordinary homeowner anymore. She was threatening. The sheriff of the town, someone sworn to uphold the law, someone trained to handle exactly this kind of confrontation. Her authority, once unquestioned, evaporated in that instant, replaced by a gnawing fear she could no longer mask. Amelia spoke no words. She didn't need to. Her badge, her calm presence, and the quiet certainty in her eyes carried the weight of every law Marjorie had broken in that reckless moment. Without a single shout or gesture, she reached for her phone, called dispatch, and within minutes, the wail of approaching sirens cut through the heavy silence of Willow Creek. The arrival of police cars shattered the neighborhood's stillness. Lights flashed across the tidy lawns, illuminating the truth that had long been hidden beneath the surface of manicured perfection. Neighbors who had once cowered in silence now gathered at the edges of their driveways, whispering in disbelief. The mighty HOA president, the woman who had dictated every aspect of their lives, was standing with a gun still loosely gripped in her hand, while uniformed officers closed in on her. She tried to stammer excuses, insisting she had only been protecting the neighborhood, that Amelia had been defiant, that the HOA bylaws gave her certain rights. But her words crumbled under the weight of the law. No bylaw could excuse pulling a weapon on an unarmed neighbor. No rulebook could override the sight of the sheriff standing there, steady and unafraid, badge gleaming in the afternoon light. The officers disarmed Marjorie quickly, treating her not as a leader, but as a criminal suspect. The sight of her wrists, being cuffed, the HOA's queen bee suddenly powerless, sent a ripple through the neighborhood. For the first time, the residents of Willow Creek saw what many had secretly wished for, but never dared to imagine. Marjorie stripped of her control. Yet even as she was led away, her eyes darted across the gathering crowd. There was no remorse in them, only the smoldering fire of someone who refused to accept defeat. In her mind, this was not the end, but a temporary setback. And though Amelia had diffused the immediate threat, she knew this confrontation would not end with one arrest. People like Marjorie didn't let go of power easily. They clawed, schemed, and manipulated, determined to rise again no matter how far they fell. The days that followed were filled with tension. Officially, the HOA president was facing charges, her weapon confiscated, her authority challenged in court. But unofficially, whispers spread through the community. Some neighbors cheered Amelia in secret, dropping by with quiet words of gratitude. Others remained fearful, wondering what would happen if Marjorie managed to return. And a few, loyal to her reign, clung to the belief that Amelia had somehow provoked her, twisting the story to protect the woman who had once held them in her grip. For Amelia, the ordeal was far from over. She had exposed herself not just as a homeowner but as the sheriff, blending her private life with her professional one in a way she had never intended. Her presence in Willow Creek was no longer quiet or unnoticed. She was now the focal point of every conversation, the figure at the center of a community torn between relief and unease. And Marjorie, even from the confines of a holding cell, was not done. She had allies, people within the HOA board who had grown accustomed to her power, who feared what Amelia's presence meant for their carefully constructed empire of rules and fines. Already, plans were being whispered, meetings scheduled, strategies formed. If Marjorie couldn't regain her position openly, her supporters would find a way to fight from the shadows. The neighborhood, once a picture of pristine order, had been split wide open. A gun had been drawn, a sheriff had revealed herself, and the balance of power had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. But the war for Willow Creek was far from over. The battle lines had only just been drawn, and Amelia, whether she wanted to or not, was now at the heart of it. The shock of Marjorie's arrest lingered in Willow Creek like a heavy fog. For a brief moment, the neighborhood breathed freely. Lawns were still trimmed, hedges still pruned, but for the first time in years, no one was peering nervously at their driveways or scanning their mailboxes for the next fine. The sight of their president being led away in handcuffs had cracked the illusion of her invincibility. But peace, as Amelia knew, was rarely permanent. Behind closed doors, the HOA board was restless. For years they had lived comfortably in Marjorie's shadow, allowing her to be the face of authority while they quietly enjoyed the fruits of her iron-fisted rule. Membership dues flowed steadily, fines padded their accounts, and those who dared to resist were quickly silenced by her relentless enforcement. With Marjorie gone, even temporarily, the machine they had built together risked collapsing. And so, whispers began to circulate. At first, it was subtle. A neighbor would mention over the fence that Amelia had been too aggressive, that perhaps she had provoked Marjorie. Another would murmur that the sheriff's involvement in neighborhood disputes was a conflict of interest. Soon, a narrative began to form, not of a reckless HOA president pointing a gun at an innocent homeowner, but of a power struggle between two women, each fighting for control. The board had found its weapon, and it wasn't a firearm. It was perception. Amelia, of course, sensed it. As sheriff, she had seen how easily fear and loyalty could be twisted. She noticed the way some neighbors avoided eye contact, how others lowered their voices when she passed. She wasn't blind to the lingering presence of Marjorie's allies, who attended board meetings with renewed urgency, plotting their next move. Though the gun incident had been a decisive blow, the HOA's war machine was still alive. Then came the letters. Not official ones this time, but anonymous flyers slipped under doors and left in mailboxes. They accused Amelia of abusing her badge, of intimidating Marjorie, of bringing unnecessary police involvement into a private community dispute. They painted her not as a protector, but as a tyrant in uniform. For neighbors already hesitant to take sides, the words sowed seeds of doubt. For those still loyal to Marjorie, they provided fuel for open defiance. The irony wasn't lost on Amelia. The same tactics Marjorie had once used against residents, threats, rumors, manipulation, were now being turned against her. The HOA board was desperate, clawing at whatever leverage they could find to maintain their grip. Yet unlike the neighbors who had crumbled under such pressure before, Amelia stood firm. She catalogued each flyer, noted each attempt at intimidation, and prepared for what she knew was coming. Escalation. And escalate it did. Within weeks, the HOA board announced an emergency meeting, framing it as a chance to restore order to Willow Creek. The timing was no coincidence. Marjorie's trial date loomed, and her allies were determined to rally the community in her defense. Attendance was mandatory for members, and while Amelia's home was exempt, the board made sure to spread word that her absence would be noted. The meeting was held in the community center, a sterile building that had long been Marjorie's throne room. The turnout was massive. Residents who rarely spoke up came to listen, while others arrived eager to defend their embattled leader. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation and suspicion. At the front, members of the board stood in a neat row, their polished smiles thinly veiling the storm beneath. They began with carefully crafted speeches. They spoke of unity, of tradition, of the need for strong leadership in uncertain times. They hinted that Amelia's involvement had been heavy-handed, that she had embarrassed the community by overreacting to what they now framed as a misunderstanding. Each word was chosen to blur the truth, to recast Marjorie not as a criminal, but as a victim of circumstance. Amelia sat near the back, silent, observing. She didn't need to interrupt. The lies were transparent to those who knew the truth. Yet she also saw the way heads nodded, the way fear and habit made people cling to the familiar authority of the HOA. Even after everything, many still struggled to imagine life without Marjorie's rules. When the floor opened for comments, the divide in Willow Creek became undeniable. Some residents spoke boldly, condemning Marjorie's actions and praising Amelia for protecting the neighborhood. Others, however, echoed the board's narrative, questioning Amelia's judgment, suggesting she had escalated the situation unnecessarily. The room split in two, not by property lines, but by loyalty. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. The HOA wasn't going to surrender quietly. They announced plans to temporarily appoint an interim president to serve until Marjorie's case was resolved. Though they claimed it was for stability, everyone knew it was a calculated move to keep her influence alive. The appointee was one of her closest allies, a man known more for his eagerness to enforce fines than for fairness or reason. For Amelia, the message was clear. Removing Marjorie from the picture had not dismantled the system. It had only exposed how deeply its roots ran. The HOA was more than one woman with a clipboard. It was an entire structure built on fear, money, and control. And now, that structure had set its sights on her. As she left the community center that night, Amelia felt the weight of the stares that followed her. Some were grateful, others resentful, but all of them knew that the battle for Willow Creek was far from finished. The gun incident had been the spark, but what was unfolding now was a full-scale war for power, with the HOA board determined to crush her before she could dismantle their empire. What they didn't realize was that Amelia wasn't just fighting as a homeowner anymore. She was fighting as the sheriff, with the law itself on her side, and if the HOA wanted a war, she was ready to meet them head-on. The weeks leading up to Marjorie's trial carried a strange, uneasy rhythm through Willow Creek. On the surface, life moved on. Lawns still glistened with sprinklers each morning, children still pedaled bikes along the sidewalks, and cars pulled neatly into driveways each evening. But beneath that facade, tension wound itself tighter with each passing day. Conversations at mailboxes were clipped. Neighbors avoided each other's gazes, and every whisper seemed to circle back to the same question. What would become of their HOA president? The courthouse, a modest brick building downtown, became the epicenter of gossip. On the morning of the trial, Residents clustered in small groups outside the entrance, their hushed tones rising and falling like the hum of cicadas. Some had come in solidarity, determined to support the woman who had ruled over them for years. Others, equally determined, were there to see her finally face the consequences of her actions. For Amelia, it was neither spectacle nor entertainment. It was justice unfolding step by deliberate step. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Marjorie sat at the defense table, her once sharp presence dimmed but not extinguished. The confidence she had wielded in Willow Creek had transformed into defiance, her chin raised as though daring the court to question her authority. Her lawyers painted her as a misunderstood leader, a woman who had dedicated years to protecting
her neighborhood, only to be vilified by a neighbor who happened to carry a badge. The prosecution, however, was unrelenting. The weapon, the eyewitness accounts, the dispatch records, every piece of evidence stacked higher, each one a reminder
that no bylaw could shield her from the reality of what she had done. When Amelia took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. Calm, precise, and unwavering, she recounted the events of that day, the letters, the escalation, the moment the gun was raised. Her words carried no malice, no exaggeration. They were simply the truth, laid bare for all to hear. For those who had doubted her, it was a sobering reminder of the fine line between order and tyranny, between leadership and obsession. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty of brandishing a weapon with intent to intimidate, guilty of reckless endangerment, guilty of threatening a public official. The sentencing was less than some had hoped for, but far more than Marjorie had ever believed possible. She would face time in custody, her power in Willow Creek stripped from her hands, her reign broken. For the neighborhood, it should have been the end. But in reality, it was only the beginning. The HOA board, unwilling to let their empire collapse, doubled down. They framed the verdict not as justice, but as a miscarriage of it, a punishment too harsh for a woman who had only been protecting her community. Flyers and emails began circulating again, this time more brazen, portraying Marjorie as a martyr sacrificed on the altar of power. They accused Amelia of exploiting her position, of orchestrating the trial to seize influence over Willow Creek. The smear campaign grew louder, more organized, and though many dismissed it, others clung to the narrative like a lifeline. What the board underestimated, however, was the quiet tide of resistance rising among the residents. For years, they had lived under Marjorie's thumb, too afraid to speak out. But seeing her cuffed, seeing her exposed, had awakened something in them. Neighbors who had once paid fines in silence began to question the legitimacy of the HOA's authority. Small gatherings formed in living rooms and backyards, not of Marjorie's loyalists, but of those who wanted change. They talked of dissolving the board, of reclaiming their neighborhood from the grip of fear. Amelia remained watchful, but careful. She knew she couldn't wage the battle for them, not as sheriff and not as a homeowner. This was their fight, to own. Still, she provided quiet guidance when asked, reminding them of their legal rights, helping them navigate the complicated web of bylaws and contracts that had long been used against them. Her presence gave them courage, even if she never raised her voice in the meetings, the board noticed. They saw the shift, the subtle unraveling of their control, and it made them desperate. With Marjorie behind bars, they needed a symbol, someone to rally around. They leaned heavily on the interim president, grooming him into her successor, but his attempts to command authority fell flat. He lacked her charisma, her ruthless energy, her ability to strike fear with a glance. Without Marjorie, the HOA machine sputtered, struggling to keep itself alive. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself began to fracture more visibly. Fences were painted in colors that once would have drawn immediate fines. Garden ornaments multiplied across lawns. Neighbors who had long resented the HOA's micromanagement began to reclaim their properties as their own, each act of rebellion small but symbolic. For the first time, Willow Creek was beginning to look less like a pristine showroom and more like a community of individuals. But progress came at a cost. The board, feeling its grip slipping, lashed out with a wave of new fines and threats, hoping to scare the residents back into submission. When that failed, they turned their efforts toward Amelia with renewed vigor. Petitions circulated to have her removed from the neighborhood, claiming her presence was divisive. Anonymous. Complaints were filed against her with the sheriff's department, accusing her of misconduct. None of them held weight, but each was designed to drain her resolve, to wear her down. Amelia endured it, steady as always. Yet she knew the board's desperation made them dangerous. People backed into corners, rarely acted rationally, and the HOA was a cornered animal now, claws out and teeth bared. The trial had removed their queen, but the hive still buzzed with fury, unwilling to die quietly. The neighborhood, once united in silent submission, now stood divided between two futures, one where the HOA reclaimed its throne, and one where it crumbled completely. The balance teetered, fragile and uncertain, and all it would take was one more spark to set everything ablaze, and that spark was coming. The verdict against Marjorie should have ended the chaos in Willow Creek, but instead it fanned the flames. The HOA board, stripped of their figurehead yet unwilling to surrender, dug in deeper. Their desperation oozed through every notice, every email, every fine that arrived in neighbors' mailboxes. It was no longer about maintaining order. It was about survival. The structure Marjorie had built was crumbling, and those who remained at the helm clung to it with a ferocity born of fear. The neighborhood reflected the tension like a mirror cracked down the middle. On one side were those who had long suffered under the HOA's heavy hand, newly emboldened by Marjorie's downfall. They began pushing back openly, refusing to pay dues, rejecting fines, and organizing quiet meetings that grew into louder gatherings. On the other side were the loyalists, residents who believed structure and fear were necessary, who had grown so used to the HOA's dominance that the thought of freedom felt like chaos. Between the two camps, Willow Creek felt less like a neighborhood and more like a battlefield waiting for its decisive clash. The board's next move was calculated, ruthless, and designed to fracture whatever unity their opponents had begun to build. They announced a special election, a hastily arranged vote, to decide whether the HOA's powers should be expanded for the sake of stability. It was a last-ditch effort to codify their control, to grant themselves sweeping authority that would make rebellion nearly impossible. They framed it as a chance to restore order, but everyone could see it for what it was: a power grab. Flyers promoting the election plastered community notice boards. Emails flooded inboxes. Board members went door to door, urging residents to vote in favor, whispering of anarchy if they didn't. And behind it all, the shadow of Marjorie lingered, her allies reminding anyone who would listen that she had been wronged, that the sheriff had ruined her life, that voting yes was the only way to honor her years of service. Amelia watched the campaign unfold with a steady, measured calm. She knew she could not interfere directly. The law did not extend to dismantling homeowner associations unless crimes were involved. This battle had to be fought by the residents themselves. But she also knew the board's tactics were effective, preying on fear and uncertainty. If the vote succeeded, the neighborhood would sink deeper under their control than ever before. As the day of the election approached, tensions spilled into the open. Arguments broke out on sidewalks, neighbors shouted across fences, and once friendly, block gatherings disintegrated into bitter disputes. The pristine image of Willow Creek was gone, replaced by cracks that no amount of paint or landscaping could cover. Even children sensed the division, their play fractured along the invisible lines their parents had drawn. On the evening of the vote, the community center buzzed with restless energy. Residents filed in, some with heads high in defiance, others with wary glances over their shoulders. The board stood at the front like generals before a battle, their smiles strained, their eyes watchful. The ballots were cast, folded, and dropped into the box, each slip of paper carrying the weight of the neighborhood's future. When the votes were tallied, the results shocked even the board. The motion to expand their powers failed, but barely. The margin was slim, a handful of votes separating the two sides. The defeat left the board reeling, their carefully orchestrated campaign undone by a community that had finally found its voice. For the residents who had opposed them, it was a victory, but not one that brought relief. The closeness of the result proved just how divided Willow Creek had become. For the board, the loss was intolerable. They had gambled everything and failed, and now their grip was slipping through their fingers. But instead of conceding, they hardened. They issued fines at unprecedented levels, targeting known dissenters with relentless precision. Cars were towed for minor infractions, lawns cited. For imaginary violations, mailboxes flagged for not meeting arbitrary standards. Each action was meant to punish, to send a message that defiance carried consequences. The retaliation backfired. Instead of breaking spirits, it fueled outrage. Residents who had once remained neutral began to question the fairness of it all. Families who had never attended a meeting showed up to protest. The neighborhood, once docile under Marjorie's thumb, was transforming into a collective force of resistance. And at the center of it all stood Amelia, not as their leader, but as their quiet symbol of resilience. The board, increasingly cornered, shifted from intimidation to sabotage. They filed formal complaints against Amelia, claiming she was abusing her role as sheriff to interfere in community affairs. They accused her of harassment, of corruption, of leveraging her badge to intimidate the HOA. None of it held up under scrutiny, but the constant barrage was meant to wear her down, to exhaust her into retreat. Amelia did not retreat. She moved. Through it all with the same calm composure she had shown the day Marjorie pointed a gun at her. She handled each complaint with professionalism, each accusation with evidence, each smear with silence. Where others might have cracked, she remained unshaken. And the more she endured, the more the residents rallied behind her. The board didn't see it then, but their campaign was self-destructing. Each desperate move, each heavy-handed attempt at control, only highlighted their corruption. Their empire, once hidden behind bylaws and bureaucracy, was now exposed in the harsh light of day. Still, they refused to accept defeat. Their final act would not be a vote, nor a fine, nor a smear. It would be something reckless, something that echoed the very mistake Marjorie had made. In their desperation, they would take one last gamble, one last strike, one last attempt to silence the sheriff who had become their greatest threat. And when that moment came, the fate of Willow Creek would be decided once and for all. The HOA board's desperation reached its breaking point in the days after the failed election. Their authority, once absolute, was unraveling faster than they could contain it. Every attempt to reassert control, fines, threats, complaints, had only backfired, and now the neighborhood no longer feared them. What they feared instead was irrelevance, the complete collapse of the system that had given them power, influence, and control over every blade of grass in Willow Creek. The board knew they were losing. And when people like that lose, they don't go quietly. They strike harder, faster, and with reckless abandon. For weeks, Amelia had anticipated it, her instincts telling her that their final move would be the most dangerous yet. She didn't know what form it would take, but she recognized the pattern all too well. People who thrived on control often destroyed themselves when it slipped away. That moment came on a humid evening, when the air clung heavy and the streets of Willow Creek were unusually quiet. The board, emboldened by their dwindling circle of loyalists, attempted one last show of dominance. They gathered outside Amelia's home, their presence deliberate, their voices raised not in discussion, but in accusation. It wasn't enough to target her with paperwork or rumors anymore. They wanted a public spectacle, something to remind the neighborhood that they still had teeth. At first, it was posturing, shouted demands, threats of legal action, claims that Amelia was unfit. to live in the community she had ruined. But as the crowd thickened, their restraint thinned. Someone hurled a rock at her fence. Another began recording on their phone, eager to broadcast the confrontation to a wider audience. And then, in a chilling echo of Marjorie's downfall, one of the board members revealed a weapon. The neighborhood froze. It was as if the ghost of that first confrontation had returned, haunting Willow Creek with a grim reminder of how far things had spiraled. But this time, there was no surprise. Amelia had been ready. She stepped forward calmly, the same steady presence she had been since the beginning, her badge gleaming in the dim light. The air seemed to shift as the residents realized the gravity of what they were witnessing, not just another HOA power play, but a direct threat against the sheriff of their town. Neighbors who had once watched from behind curtains now emerged into the street, drawn by the noise, compelled by the tension. What happened next unfolded with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Amelia, unflinching, took control of the situation. Years of training guided her every move, every decision, every wordless command. The weapon was disarmed swiftly, the aggressor restrained, the board's reckless gambit collapsing in front of the very people they had tried to intimidate. Sirens followed soon after, the flashing lights of law enforcement painting the neighborhood in stark reds and blues. The spectacle was complete. The HOA board, once untouchable, stood exposed before their community, as nothing more than bullies, with clipboards and now criminals with poor judgment. One by one, their allies faltered, their loyalty crumbling in the face of undeniable truth. The arrests that followed were not just about weapons or threats. They were about years of corruption, misuse of funds, and intimidation tactics that, once investigated, unraveled into a web of wrongdoing too vast to ignore. For Willow Creek, it was the moment everything shifted. The fear that had once gripped the neighborhood evaporated, replaced by something that had been missing for far too long: unity. Residents who had cowered under Marjorie's shadow began to speak freely, their voices no longer stifled. They gathered not to follow, but to decide together what kind of community they wanted to live in. The HOA, once a symbol of power, became a cautionary tale of what happens when control is allowed to fester unchecked. Amelia, though central to it all, never sought to claim credit. She remained the same steady presence she had been from the start, protecting, guiding, but never dictating. Her role as sheriff had demanded her intervention, but it was the residents themselves who carried the final victory. They dissolved the HOA in a unanimous vote weeks later, freeing themselves from the chains of fear and fines that had bound them for so long. The neighborhood began to change in small but meaningful ways. Lawns grew more colorful with flowers, and ornaments once forbidden. Children laughed freely in yards without fear of violations. Neighbors who had been strangers found themselves talking, connecting, sharing meals and stories. The pristine uniformity that Marjorie had prized so highly gave way to individuality, and with it came something far more valuable: a true sense of community. As for Amelia, she returned to her duties as sheriff, her life in Willow Creek quiet once more. But her presence carried a new weight, not of authority forced upon others, but of respect freely given. She had stood firm when it mattered most, and in doing so, she had helped her neighbors reclaim more than just their properties. She had helped them reclaim their freedom. Marjorie, meanwhile, faded into the shadows of legal battles and prison time. Her name, once spoken in whispers of fear, became little more than a reminder of how easily power can corrupt. The board members who had stood by her side faced their own reckonings, some in court, others in the shame of their neighbors' eyes. Willow Creek would never be the same, but perhaps that was the point. It was no longer a place of manicured perfection and hidden tyranny. It was a place of resilience, of rebirth, of neighbors who had learned that true strength lay not in submission, but in standing together. And so, the story of the HOA president who pointed a gun at the sheriff's daughter ended not with fines or threats, but with a neighborhood transformed. A community once ruled by fear had found its voice, its courage, and its freedom. The reign of the HOA was over,